In this video, we're going to look at how a coordinated board can influence our decision making when we are the main aggressor in the pot. In this first hand, we raise ace-10 suited from the button and flop top pair top kicker against a single opponent. The flop is highly coordinated, meaning that there is a reasonable chance our opponent could have connected with this flop as well, possibly even better than we did. However, there are also many inferior made and drawing hands that will call a bet. Our hand is likely to be ahead of our opponent's range, but it's vulnerable to a number of turn cards, so we should make a continuation bet for value and protection. The turn is a brick, meaning that it does little to affect the actual value of our hand or the relative strength we or our opponent place on our hands. We've been checked to again and can either bet for value or check back for pot control. In deciding which is the optimal choice, we must consider our opponent's likely range and strength on this coordinated board. It's fairly unlikely that our opponent would just call us on the flop if he had a hand stronger than our own. This is because most players are aware that even very strong hands are vulnerable to scare cards and action killers. On a flop as coordinated as this one, we would expect our opponent to have raised our flop bet with any hand that was as strong as or stronger than 2 pair. This being the case, we can usually expect to only be behind over pairs, and it's very unlikely our opponent has pocket jacks or better since he didn't re-raise us pre-flop. It's most likely that our opponent has a weaker made hand than our own and or some kind of draw. We should therefore normally bet here, again both for value and protection. The river completes none of the draws that were possible on the flop, and our opponent checks to us again. If he was drawing, he has failed to improve. Having check called twice, it's still very unlikely that our opponent has a stronger hand than our own. Most players would have raised such hands either on the flop or, at the very least, on the turn. Because the flop was so coordinated, most opponents will realise that we could have been betting the flop and turn with quite a wide range of hands that contained many semi-bluffs. As such, it's quite hard for our opponent to fold any hand with decent showdown value like top or second pair. It follows that since we believe we have the best hand and we believe that our opponent can have and is unlikely to fold a number of inferior hands, we should make a fairly large bet for value. In this hand, we raise king-queen suited and flop a flush draw with the possibility of having 2 live overcards. This type of hand usually has a good chance of winning by the river, even against made hands such as ace-9 or a pocket pair. We should make a continuation bet. The turn gives us extra outs as we can now make a straight with any 10 on the river. Our opponent checked to us for a second time. In this situation, many players are tempted to check to try and hit an improvement card for free, and this is a perfectly viable option. However, as we established before, it's not particularly likely our opponent would choose not to raise our bet with a strong hand on this wet flop. Since it's fairly unlikely our opponent has a strong hand and we have a lot of outs that we could hit on the river should our opponent call a bet from us, this is a great spot to make a semi-bluff. When faced with another bet, after this overcard has come on the turn, it's quite hard for our opponent to continue with a lot of the medium strength pairs that he has in his range, such as 9x, pocket 8s, pocket 7s, and so on. Even if our opponent does continue in the hand, we still have a very good chance of winning a nice pot here. As both these hands demonstrate, an opponent's range of possible holdings is often far larger on coordinated boards. In both cases, our opponent could feasibly call a flop bet with a large number of hands. On an uncoordinated board, we can more readily narrow down our opponent's likely hand ranges based on the fact that there are far less hands they would be willing to call bets with. We cannot so easily make those same assumptions on a coordinated board, and our opponents are faced with the same problem with regards to figuring out our range. However, we can draw some conclusions about the strength of our opponent's hands based on the way they choose to play them, as long as we understand how coordinated boards are likely to affect the way they'd play different types of hands. In these cases, we were able to conclude that our opponents were not likely to have a powerful hand based on the fact that it would be very dangerous for them to slow play on a coordinated board when out of position. In identifying the likely strength of our opponent's ranges, we were able to maximise our value in the first hand and, in the second hand, establish that we had a good chance of successfully semi-bluffing.